Thank you, Larry, for that overly generous and incredibly long and boring introduction. I'm glad that I'm proud of my Norwegian heritage. I'm glad he didn't mention, though, that we did take Sicily for a long period of time. It was a Norwegian, a Scandinavian fiefdom for many, many years, and that's where Italian cookie comes from, is from the Vikings who conquered Sicily. You don't think that? Okay. I was really interested in the panel. Don't mean to be derivative, but I want to sort of start with a note that we heard throughout that panel, which was, we're sort of in a mess today. Our political system is not running too smoothly and is in need of repair. I want to step back like they did for just a moment, though, to look at how we got here, because if we don't understand how we got here, I'm not certain we can understand how we can get out of this. Because there's a tendency, particularly now, to blame it on one person, but it is a more systemic problem, in my opinion, than that. He's the expression of the problem, not necessarily the problem all by himself. Part of it came from the Bush era. Paul was right. President Bush wanted to be the uniter, not the divider, but our country was divided over the Iraq War. No ifs and ands or buts about it. Now, war is always a powerful potential divider in the modern era, as Vietnam was, as First Gulf War could have been. In my opinion, the Iraq War was made more difficult politically, in part because of politics. President Bush's view was that the original vote on the war resolution ought to be held after the 2002 elections during the lame duck in order to keep it from becoming an issue in the midterms. But the leader of the Democrats and the leader of the Senate, Tom Daschle, forced a vote in October of 2002 on the war resolution. This made it political. When you raise an issue in the closing days of a midterm election, whether you like it or not, there's going to be some political stink that stays on it. And then we had the problem then on July 4th, 2003, Ted Kennedy, whom I had great admiration for and with whom we worked closely in the years ahead on immigration reform, went out and gave a speech in which he declared that George W. Bush had lied about the presence of WMD in Iraq. Now, he himself knew this was a lie. He himself had looked at the same intelligence that Bush looked at and came to the same conclusion, that Saddam Hussein possessed WMD, that he had programs of nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare that represented a danger to our interests and the interests of those in the region and our allies. But his attitude was we ought to solve that problem through diplomacy, not through the use of force. He went and gave a speech at Georgetown University outlining this theory and saying he has the weapons, but we ought to use diplomacy to disarm him, not war. But for purposes of politics, to defeat Bush in the 2004 election, he said this on the 4th of July, and 2 days later, virtually every major Democrat from Harry Reid on down began to echo this, which was a constant theme. But that was it, in my opinion, politics. And you can't stop people who are in politics from playing politics, but it contributed to the animosity in the country over the Iraq War. Then we had the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, which caused a great deal of cynicism that still emanates today and rumbles around our political system on both the left and the right. And then we had the 8 years of President Obama. I worked closely with him in the White House. After he was elected in 2004, you may not know this, but it's a practice that the senior aides, at least in Bush White House and earlier, they would take the senior aides in the White House. I see our Clinton White House colleague nodding. The senior aides in the White House are all sort of split up so that they are members of the Senate. Every member of the Senate has somebody on the White House staff whom they are sort of, it's their job, the White House staffer's job, to become their friends so that when they want to talk to the president, they don't feel obligated to call the president. They call you and chew on your ass instead. And most of the major players in the House also are similarly. So they sent around a list after the 2004 election, said, here are the new members in the Senate. Anybody know any of these people? And I turned my list back in, and a few days later they came back and said, you're in charge of developing a rapport with Senator Obama. I said, well, I don't know him. I'm not from Illinois. I have no relationship with him. They said, well, nobody else does either. But your former deputy was his classmate at Harvard Law and helped get him elected editor of the Harvard Law Review. So use your common friendship with Ken to develop a rapport. So for the next 3 years, Obama was my charge. And I must say, I had a belief that he would unite our country, that it would be not red states and blue states, but United States. But early on, we got a different tone. You maybe remember one of your local members, Representative Cantor, was deputized to go in February of 2009 and say, here are the suggestions of the House Republican caucus on the stimulus bill. And before he could even pro-offer his suggestions, President Obama cut him off with that famous line, "I won." That October, I happened to have, I won't go into the details, but I had dinner with Larry Summers, hosted by my pal Ben Stein. Bueller. And during the course of the dinner, Summers says to me, well, I don't understand why we didn't get more Republican support for the stimulus bill. It was necessary, needed to be done. So I said, well, why do you think that is, Carl? I said, well, I knew the answers to the questions I was about ready to ask. I said, well, let me ask you, were you in the room when he said I won? He said, oh, yeah. I said, did you see anything wrong with that? No. I said, did you ever go up on the Hill as the National Economic Council director and ask the House Republicans, what are your ideas? No, we knew what we wanted to do. I said, did you ever contemplate swapping out something that they wanted for something you had in your package in order to give them a piece of the action? He said, oh, no, we had the right answers. I said, well, why should you expect them to vote for you or vote for your proposal if they don't think they've had a seat at the table and there's nothing in there that they really wanted? Compromise and taking into account people's attitudes on the other side of the aisle. After 9/11, we had a need for a stimulus package. We're out in Chicago we're going to relaunch the airlines. And United Airlines and American crews, many of whom had lost a friend or a colleague on the flights that went into the Pentagon and into Pennsylvania and into the Twin Towers, were at this very emotional event in Chicago. And the president invited the House Democratic leader, Dick Gephardt, to ride back to Washington with us. And on the way back, we're sitting in the president's cabin, and he says to Gephardt, he says, Dick, we got to have a stimulus bill, and here's what I'm going to propose. And at the top of it was a cut in the permanent rates for corporate taxes. And Gephardt said, can't do that. Nobody in our caucus will go for that. If you'll substitute immediate expensing and depreciation, some Democrats will vote for that, but we can't vote for that. We got back to the White House. The president picks up the phone, calls Larry Lindsey, the head of the National Economic Council, and says, we're going to swap this out. Gephardt says, no Democrat's going to be able to vote for that. We need to unite the country. So we did. Larry didn't like it because he said this is going to have the biggest economic impact and permanent impact, and expensing and depreciation will be sugar in the short run, but not in the long run. So we swapped it out, passed the House. I was watching the vote on my television, and Gephardt voted no, and I was pissed. It may surprise you that I'm a little bit of a hothead. So I went into the Oval Office. I said, Mr. President, he said, you look a little upset. I said, Dick Gephardt voted no. And he laughed at me. He said, did you really expect him to vote for it? I said, yeah, you did exactly what he wanted you to do. He said he wasn't going to vote for it, but at least he knows that I'm listening to him. And enough Democrats voted for this that we got it done. Grow up. We didn't see that. We saw things done on a party line vote, and Kate was right. I was appalled when President Obama invited Paul Ryan as the chairman of the House Republican Budget Committee in 2011 to attend a speech at Georgetown University, put him right in the front row, and then excoriated the House Republican Budget Committee resolution as, quote, un-American. That's not the tone you want. And 8 years of this, plus the aftermath of the financial crisis, plus the leftover of the Iraq War, has put us into a tribal country. The financial crisis is still today reverberating on the left and right. Populism is its result. We did the right thing, but President Obama made a mistake in trying to make it look like it was all his work. The TARP legislation was passed under Bush, signed by Bush. The money to the banks went out under Bush. The first $25 billion to the car companies went out under Bush. If he were smart, he would have said, we did this together, Republicans and Democrats. And instead, he tried to say, this is all me. I did it all. And as a result, the right said, we have no part of this deal. And we had the growth of the Tea Party that said, what you did with TARP was bail out the people who had a lobbyist in Washington or a loophole in the law, or Solyndra, your buddies, who got our money from us out of our pockets, taken to the federal government, laundered, and given out to special interests. And the left said, you bailed out the bankers, but you didn't bail out the little guy. So we had this weird populism of both left and right saying the relationship between the government and the ordinary person has got to be rebalanced because the financial crisis had put it way out of whack. And each side, whether they were on the right or the left, blamed the government, blamed Washington for not having treated them fairly. And then we had this sort of sense that the elites were looking down over flyover America, that everybody between Washington and maybe Chicago occasionally, but the West Coast, that everybody else in between was being looked down upon by people who decided it was more, they were smarter in Washington than the ordinary American was. Look, there are lots of reasons to sell the Affordable Care Act, but telling people if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, and that your premiums are going to go down. None of those were true. And everybody knew who said them that they were not promises that could be kept. And the corrosive effect of people having to deal with the aftermath of those kind of promises contributed again to this cynicism about who are these people in Washington that they think they are better than me. And as a result, we have a politics that is tribal. If a Republican attacks a Democratic president, the Democrats will come to his aid no matter what. And if Democrats attack a Republican president, Republicans will come to his aid no matter what. This, in the short run, left the Republican Party full of very angry people who in 2016 decided the only thing they wanted was somebody who would take a brick and throw it through the plate glass window and stop what President Obama was doing in their eyes. And one guy came up and said, "I'll do that." Other people said, "I've been the successful governor of Wisconsin or Florida," or "I've been this and I've been that." But one guy said, "You don't know who I am except I'm a disruptor, and I'll get that brick and I'll throw it." And they nominated him. And the Democrats, they weren't in good shape either. Think about it. Think about the two people who ran for president on the Democratic ticket in 2016 for the nomination. Bernie Sanders was elected mayor of Burlington, ran and lost a race for governor of Vermont, was elected to the U.S. House, was elected to the United States Senate 2 times, and the convention in Philadelphia was the first time in his life he attended a Democratic convention. The first office he sought as a Democrat was the presidency of the United States. In every one of those previous races, he had been defeated by or had defeated a Republican and a Democrat because he ran as a self-proclaimed Democratic Socialist Independent in Vermont. And yet he got 47% of the vote and raised $230 million without holding a single fundraising event. That's how angry the left inside the Democratic Party had become with what they had seen as sort of the benign treatment of President Obama, who to a lot of Americans was too liberal, but to them was not liberal enough. And then we had Hillary Clinton, and there are lots of good things that can be said about her. But being a good candidate and being a fresh face and being a voice for the future, none of those three can be attributed to her. The Democrats achieved the impossible. They nominated the one person who could lose a general election to Donald J. Trump. I'm a political junkie, so I read all these stupid books. If you want to read a book about the 2016 election, read Shattered, written by 2 young reporters who had an agreement with the Clinton campaign. They thought they were going to write the book about shattering the glass ceiling. So they had all kinds of inside access with the understanding that what they were given could not be used until after the election. And you read that book and you see a dysfunctional campaign from top to bottom, and it is being driven by the persona of one individual, Hillary Rodham Clinton. So we had this weird election. 37% of the electorate said, "I like Donald Trump. I think he's qualified, has the temperament and the right attitude, and he's an agent of change, and I'm going to vote for him for president." 9% of the electorate said, "I do not think Donald Trump is qualified by experience, temperament, or background to be president of the United States, but he's an agent of change, and I hate her." And that 46% was enough to make him president. Paul was right. Wins Wisconsin by about 22,000 votes. And there are 25,000 fewer votes in the African-American wards of Milwaukee. Wins Michigan by 11,000 votes, and there are 25,000 fewer votes in the city of Detroit. Wins Pennsylvania by about 40-some-odd thousand votes, and there are 65,000 fewer votes in the African-American wards of Philadelphia. She is shipping volunteers from Michigan to Iowa, which she was going to lose, and loses Michigan by 11,000 votes. I mean, this is about as dysfunctional a campaign as you could ever have it. But let's be honest. Both political parties are broken for different reasons in some cases, but both of them are at war with each other. The Republicans nominated somebody for president who has never been an active Republican. Before his own race for the presidency, his largest political contributions were in 2006 to elect a Democratic House majority and make Nancy Pelosi Speaker. And in March of 2007, when asked about how he thought she was doing, on election night, he took the New York Post and the next morning and autographed it to her and sent it to her, and she framed it and hung it in one of her offices. And in March of 2007, he was asked, how do you think she's doing? He says, I think she's doing a tremendous job, but she hasn't done enough to impeach George W. Bush. And this was the Republican standard bearer and sits in the White House. And the Democratic Party today is now sort of looking like the Republican Party was in 2016, full of angry people, full of resentment and grievance, whose only goal is to impeach Donald J. Trump. 43% of the American people today think he ought to be impeached. Virtually every one of them is a Democrat. They're like the Republicans were in 1997 and 1998. And look how much good it did for them back then. Now, part of this is fueled by social media, which is making it easier to make us all live in our own virtual communities of like-minded individuals who share our biases and share our perceptions and share our views, and we talk to each other and become very comfortable in our own little cocoon. It also allows for a rush to judgment, and we've seen this here. Kate talked about it, I think, with the Covington School. Now, maybe Mr. Phillips is a good guy, but he claimed to be a Vietnam veteran, turns out not to be. I didn't know this until this morning. Did you know that on Saturday night, he attempted to take his drum and walk into the National Cathedral of the Basilica and during a Mass begin to hammer on his drum in the middle of a Catholic Mass, and he had to be escorted out of the church? I mean, and how long did it take us to see these bigoted men screaming homophobic and racial epithets at a group of white teenagers from Covington, Kentucky? How long did it take us for us to see that ugliness appear? And yet we all rushed, one way or another, to judgment about this. And this is fueling things within our society. Look, I have 650,000 people who follow me on Twitter. Who the hell are these people? Don't they have something better to do? But I'll tell you one thing I don't do. I don't read my social media feed. I did it once or twice, and it reduced my opinion of the American people. And then I realized it's that kind of person who signs on and feels that in the moment of anonymity, they can say something ugly and stupid and feel better about themselves. So I don't even read that crap. I make somebody else do it. Now, admittedly, the president's behavior has been, commented on a lot. I get that. But I also thought the panel was right in pointing out that he has had some accomplishments. And to me, the amazing thing is that if you stripped away the behavior, if you stripped away the tweets, if you stripped away the outrageous comments, that he would have a record that, if we were able to draw attention to, would give him a pretty favorable rating as president. Just simply unleashing the animal spirits in our economy. I mean, we were being told that 2% growth was the new normal. We were told that 5%, 6% unemployment was the new normal. We were told this was the best we could do as a country. But simply the fact that when he came in, unleashed these animal spirits. And then coupled with regulatory relief and the beginnings of the tax reform package, we've had an economic growth here this last year, the last 2 years, that has been the envy of the world. And it's meant millions of people now have jobs that didn't have jobs before. It means millions of families have a more prosperous present and a more hopeful future than they had. And let's give the guy credit. He did things that the other side, his political opponent, said wouldn't work. Look, I like to think long term, so I am, like Paul, deeply worried about our debt and deficit. But I also like the fact that we were able to see the passage of a tax cut that made a difference. Now, look, the personal side, I'm not so hep on. But the corporate side, we were fighting the world economically with one hand tied behind our back. We were the only major industrialized country in the world that didn't have what's called a territorial tax system. If you were General Electric and you sold a piece of medical imaging equipment in Germany and made a profit, you paid a tax in Germany on that profit. But if you wanted to bring those profits back to the United States of America, you paid a second haircut, the U.S. corporate tax rate. If you were a German company, Siemens, and made a piece of equipment in Germany and sold it in the United States and made a profit, you paid a tax here, but you could take those profits home to Germany without a second haircut. So it made it more attractive to make things abroad rather than to make them here. So we had the highest corporate tax rate of any major industrialized country. How does that make us competitive? So now we have a tax system in which we don't double tax profits, foreign profits, making it attractive to bring money back home to the United States. And we have a corporate tax rate that's in roughly the same range as the rest of what's called the OECD, the major industrialized countries. And as a result, we're seeing last month 32,000 new manufacturing jobs in America. Good paying jobs that don't require, in many instances, a college education and are long term. You heard about judges, you heard about the discussion about criminal justice. I have to give the guy credit, not all the credit he claims for NAFTA. It was an update. It's not a major revision. Don't kid yourself. Every time, I cannot say USMCA without the village people starting to play in my brain someplace. But look, the deal was made in the early 90s before e-commerce and before sort of the explosion of American financial services. And when it came to the internet and e-commerce and financial services and energy policy, it was good. NATO. I don't like how he did it, but he's getting it done. Every president since Ronald Reagan has been upset about the fact that the NATO allies do not meet their commitments. President Obama did a very good thing by getting everybody to agree to a specific targeted percentage of GDP for military expenditures. But then he couldn't get them to live up to it. And this guy, call him disruptive, call him rambunctious, call him a little weird, but at least he's getting them to move in that right direction. Russia, I'm with Paul. I can imagine, I was around Putin. He's about this tall, tiny little guy. You know, he did not become the leader of Russia by being the reform-minded mayor of St. Petersburg. He was not the pro-education governor of the Petersburg districts. He's a KGB agent. He either had a file on you that made you his puppet or he killed you. He's about this tall. He's like Tony Soprano with no charm. A thug. And I'm sure that when President Obama said, I am really upset that you're doing things in our election, that he probably went home, pulled out the bottle of vodka, poured himself a big one, put a smile on his face, and downed it. But this administration has at least begun to slap sanctions on the Russians. Don't like what they're doing and trying to undo some of them now, but tough sanctions on the Russians from top to bottom, the cronies around Putin. And Syria. One good thing, one bad thing. The bad thing is what he just recently did, starting to pull our people out without a plan and without, just sort of we need to get out of there. No, we don't. We have an adversary in the region called Iran, and if U.S. troops pull out of Syria prematurely, then there will be Iranian militias, Shia militias, Iranian-sponsored groups on the border of Israel, and it's a problem. But I have to give the guy credit. When President Obama said, when asked about the use of gas by the Syrian government on its people, that it crossed a red line with them and did nothing, it hurt. I happened to be talking to one of the many thousands, tens of thousands of Saudi princes who wanted a briefing on American politics in 2016, and he sort of picked up on that and said, with actions like that, America has done the impossible in the Middle East. You have achieved what we once thought was impossible. I said, what is that, sir? He said, you have convinced the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the nation of Israel that you're a completely unreliable ally. Because we took no action. We said something and didn't do anything. And when President Trump was asked that question early in his administration, what do you think about the Syrian use of gas? Does it cross a red line with you? And he said it crossed a lot of red lines with me. I thought, here we go again. But instead, he launches 100 cruise missiles and destroys in a matter of seconds a quarter of the Syrian Air Force. And you saw the pictures. There is the hangar about the size of this stage, and in it, the hangar is standing, and inside of it, crushed by a cruise missile, is a Soviet-built, Russian-built Syrian plane. The normal president, who acted in a normal fashion, who didn't tweet about Meryl Streep's acting abilities, who said the right thing after Charlottesville, didn't listen to Steve Bannon and say, well, there are good people on both, bad people on both sides, then would have been a better, in my opinion, be in a better place today than he is. Now to the current controversy. You never drive yourself into a box canyon. Sort of an Old West thing. I'm from, I lived in Virginia for a while, but I'm a Texan. In fact, when I lived in Washington, D.C., I paid $3,000 more a year in taxes in the District of Columbia in order to keep my voting registration in Kerr County, Texas. I'm not going to be a denizen of the Beltway, I said. You don't drive yourself in there. But having gotten in there, this should have been easily resolved. But it is a sign of the dysfunction on both sides that it can't get resolved. It will be. My suspicion is we'll start to see it tomorrow. Mitch McConnell took a little beating from the panel, but he's the guy who's going to start us getting out because he's waited for the right time and now he's moving. But this is the kind of thing that in normal circumstances, Washington would have come to a deal. Trump says, I want $5.7 billion for the wall. Nancy Pelosi responds by saying it's immoral. Well, did she say it was immoral when President Obama built 133 miles of border wall? Did she say it was immoral in 2006 when we passed the Secure Fence Act with the support of Senator Obama, Senator Clinton, Senator Schumer, Senator Feinstein, Senator Reid, and others? Did she say it was immoral last year when the Senate voted 80-19 to give $1.7 billion for wall construction, with 9 of the 11 members of the Democratic Senate leadership voting yes? No, she didn't. And we do need a wall. I used to mock him for saying, I want a wall along the entire border. I said 1,954 miles of border with Texas, or with the U.S. and Mexico. Where exactly on the Rio Grande River are you going to put the wall? In the middle of the river? You're going to put it on the north side of the river where they need to get their cattle to water? Are you going to, in the Santa Elena Canyon, where the U.S. border is about 1,100 feet in the air and the Mexican border is 750 feet in the air, and it's a 150-mile-long canyon of the Rio Grande, and that's how high the border is, where exactly are you going to put the wall? He retaliated by spending 20 minutes of a speech in Dallas at a rally in early 2016, excoriating me by name. I missed most of it, but people tell me it was highly entertaining. But he's now got experts. And the experts say to him, Mr. President, we don't need a wall in the middle of the desert. We may need barriers to transit of automobiles, and we don't need a wall in the Santa Elena Canyon. We may need aerial assets or drones, or we may need technology. In parts of the border, we need to have means of detecting crossings, and then infrastructure, roads and air assets to interdict people in the middle of the desert. But we don't need this. We don't need a wall on 1,954 miles. But we do need it in heavily urbanized areas along the border. You think that people in San Diego want the neighborhoods, literally the divide between the U.S. and Mexico in many places is a street. Do you think that really we want in our country the ability of people to walk out of a neighborhood in Mexico and walk into a neighborhood in the U.S. and not be detected? And we've got communities in Calexico and Yuma and Nogales and Del Rio and Eagle Pass and the lower Rio Grande Valley where they are urbanized areas. You may not know this, but there are nearly 2 million people who live in the lower Rio Grande Valley. This is not some arid patch of desert. These are people who in some cases are divided by maybe a stream that is 10 yards wide and 3 feet deep. So there are places where we need to have a wall. And normally what would happen in a contest like this is the president would say, by God, I want $5.7 million for the wall. And the Democrats would say, we're not going to give you 5.7. We'll give you 3.5. And you got to spend some of it on things other than a wall. And in return, we want protection for DACA. And he'd say, I'll give you protection for DACA. And they'd say, well, but you're not going to give us legal. You're only going to give us legal status. We want a path to citizenship. And he says, OK, you can have a path to citizenship, but they have to go to the back of the line. They don't get any special treatment. They got to apply like everybody else and go to the back of the line. Everybody would say, OK, deal done, back done. And instead, we're fighting over the difference in the budget. If he gets all the money he wants, it is 1/10 of 1% of the federal budget. So this is a sign of how dysfunctional we become, that we can't have adults who can sit down and find a way out of this, and each side walks away saying, we got something we want. But I think the sentiment in Washington is such that they want to get the shutdown concluded. And my sense is that we'll start to see in the next couple of days that there's a recognition everybody needs to walk away with something. I thought it was something when Steny Hoyer, majority leader of the Democrats in the House, said walls are necessary in some place. I thought it was a sign of something when 32 centrist Democrats said we need money for border security. There's a deal that can be made there if adults want to make a deal. And let's not kid ourselves. The blame for adults not making a deal doesn't lie with one man and one man only. Maybe he's got the principal blame for putting us into the shutdown, but lots of people are conspiring in order to keep it going. Now, looking forward, briefly, I don't know what the hell is going to happen. Trump may run again, probably will run again. And if he does, he'll be challenged in the Republican primary, but not defeated, unless something happens in the Mueller probe that I don't think is likely to happen. But I'm not so certain that he runs again. He's preparing for it. He's got some really smart people helping him. But he's about ready to have a very painful year. He's going to be going to the proctologist every day. No anesthesiologist around. And it ain't going to be pleasant. And it's not going to be pleasant for the people around him. And it's going to wear on them. And they need to get reinforcements, and it's hard to get reinforcements when he's treated people the way he's treated them. On the other hand, we got the Democrats. Now, McAuliffe said 10 to 12. I'm sort of a 20 man, but hell if I know. But there are going to be a passel of people out there. And the interesting thing to me is going to be the impact of social media on their ability to sustain themselves over the long haul. We used to depend on ABC, CBS, NBC, and maybe MSNBC and Fox, to spread CNN, to be sort of the communication vehicles. Now you can create your own channel. We got Robert Francis O'Rourke of Texas, who's got millions of people who watch him on YouTube. They tuned in to see him get his teeth cleaned. He's now on I loved the line in my column this morning. I have to admit, I've really enjoyed this one. The Jack Kerouac road trip, or the Australian Aboriginal walk around, you know. And he's out there sort of, you know, driving himself around the central part of the country, sort of dropping in on people and, you know, sharing his views and, you know, doing weird things. And there are people watching him, millions of people watching him on his own television channel. And what's going to be the effect of that? I think one effect might be that in a normal presidential campaign, McAuliffe would be right, there would be sort of people would fall by the wayside because they wouldn't be getting attention that gave them volunteers and money and enthusiasm. But the ability to communicate with people via all of these social media channels means, I mean, why? Kamala Harris is out there dancing. Okay, I feel much better about the prospect of her as president when she's dancing to Cardi B. I like diamonds, I like money. Okay, I feel better. You know, Elizabeth Warren, I think I'm going to go get a beer. Michelob Ultra. Hey, husband, you want one? Oh, okay. You know, it's weird. But it may, ironically enough, allow them to communicate with enough people to sustain them longer than they might otherwise be in the race. What's going to happen with the debates? They're going to start in June. Somebody's going to do something weird in one of those debates that's going to inspire somebody on the left to say, boy, I want to pay attention to him or her. What's going to happen with the calendar? You know, in 2008, Barack Obama was trailing Hillary Rodham Clinton in all the national polls and beat her in Iowa and jumped to the lead. Now, it didn't guarantee that he won New Hampshire. He loses New Hampshire, but it guaranteed him viability when it came to South Carolina. Well, what's going to be the effect of the calendar on this field? And is somebody going to jump to jump up? You know, we're going to have lots of people fighting for I'm the angry anti-Trump left. What happens if there's somebody like a Terry McAuliffe or a Hickenlooper who says, you know what, I'm a problem solver, and we Democrats have, you know, Terry had a good line. Not free college for all. Think about all the people who are going to be saying free college, free health care. And one guy comes along and said, no, we don't need to worry about people like me. We need to worry about people on the bottom. And so we got to be fiscally responsible. There might be a lane that the Democrat rules are very proportional. So it could be that the hard left is being chopped up by 5 or 6 or 7 candidates, and the sort of centrist is being chopped up by a couple. And as a result, one of those centrists is leading in the delegate count with the others. And what's going to happen at the Democratic convention if there are multiple candidates. And nobody has a majority on the first ballot. The Democrats have changed their rules. First of all, they're very proportional. You get, if you're at Texas and you got 300 delegates and you get 1% of the vote, you get 3 delegates. But what happens if they go to the national convention and nobody has a majority on the first ballot? They had the superdelegates until this convention, voting on the first ballot. Now they say superdelegates cannot vote on the first ballot. What happens if nobody has a majority and on the second ballot, bam, in come 700 establishment superdelegates who were appointed to the Democratic House of Lords sometime in the 1780s and have been on there ever since? What happens? For those of us who are political junkies, this could be the return to the first brokered convention with smoke-filled back rooms. And thank God they're not holding the convention in Colorado so the smoke will be of a more conventional nature. And then we go into the 2020 general election. If Trump's not a candidate, it'll be an open race on the Republican side. But assume for a moment that he is. Look, I didn't think he'd win last time, and he's going to have a rough road this time. But he could win if they nominate somebody so far out on the extreme that they Corbynize the Democratic Party. But he's got to be realistic about this. He has not done what the traditional president has done to expand his base. And as a result, he goes into the election in a difficult place. If you look at his base, it's somewhere between the 38% in the Fox poll that say they'd vote to reelect him and the 41, 42, 43, 44%, depending on what poll you look at, who approve of him. That's where he starts. On the other hand, the Democrats, I don't think they start at the 55% in the CNN poll who said they were going to vote against Trump. I think they start somewhere between 43% who say we want to impeach him and 50% who say I strongly disapprove of him, which means in order to win, I think they've got to nominate somebody that allows him to push that number below 50, recognizing it's not going to get much above, the opposition is not going to get much below 43. So he's got a narrow window for victory. They got a bigger one. But you know what? They had a bigger window in 2016, and they did a hell of a job in closing it on themselves. Let me close by talking, well, actually, I'll save this for my final. Larry's asked me to talk a little bit about McKinley and the Gilded Age, but I'll do that after questions and close this on an optimistic note rather than the dour, downbeat note that you might expect us to end on. If you got any more questions, wave them and they'll come and pick them up. Given what we heard on the panel, do you think we have a crisis on the border? Yes and no. No, we don't have the crisis that is being depicted, but we do have a crisis. And our crisis is partly the result of bad policy and partly the result of changing circumstances. We used to have, the in-migration in the United States used to be mostly single young men. And we have procedures in place to deal with them. I love, one of the interesting things about working in the White House is you got to learn all the lingo. In an immigration world, most of those people were OTMs, other than Mexicans. If you're a Mexican and we catch you, we simply return you back across the border. If you're an OTM, we have to process you out of the country. And most of the flows were Mexicans, and the flows that were not Mexicans were single male OTMs. And we had policies and procedures in place that allowed us to deal with them. Increasingly, our migrant flows are families and children. And part of this is the economic conditions and the societal conditions in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. These people are desperate. But let's also not kid ourselves. Part of this is a deliberate effort by the cartels to make money. And they sell the story of hope and opportunity for your children. What parent would not have their heart touched by somebody saying, if you can just put together enough money, we can get Jose or Maria to the United States and to the golden streets. So a lot of these flows are the cartels making money. They're not making as much from drugs, but they're now making from human trafficking. The numbers of children who come up from Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, who along the way disappear, is shocking. Girls into sex trafficking, boys into labor trafficking. And those that make it here, we don't have the right procedures in place to deal with them to begin with, and the administration, in my opinion, has made it worse by insisting on a policy of what's called zero tolerance. It used to be if you came across the border illegally, we would not charge you with a crime, and go through the process of a trial to show that you came into the United States illegally, we'd simply sanction you and send you away. But if you came back, and depending on the region and the border, 5 or 6 times, for example, in the Laredo and Del Rio region, we would then take you to court, because once you were sanctioned by a court, you would never be able to come into the United States legally and become a U.S. citizen. The administration, under Steve Miller and Senator, then Attorney General Sessions, began a policy that said, you come across the border illegally the first time, and we will sanction you so that you can never come across legally and become a citizen. And this has meant a tremendous amount of resources are dealing with this problem, as opposed to dealing with the problem of children and families where we don't have clear-cut procedures and everything takes a lot longer. So that's the crisis that we have. And we'd be better dealing with it by saying to Nicaragua, well, not so much Nicaragua, Guatemala and Honduras, what can we do to help you make your societies better? We were doing this in the Clinton years, started in '41. We continued and built on it. We worked on Mexico in particular to help stabilize their southern border. Obama did it. The administration has cut back some of those resources. I think that's a mistake. You worked in Virginia politics, college Republican, and when things were changing fast. How did this experience influence your career afterwards? I was telling Larry this earlier. Kate's dad, I was working for Kate's dad at the Republican National Committee. I'd been the college executive director and at the age of 20, and then I got elected college chairman, and then I got a job at the committee working for a tall, lanky, former oilman, failed Senate candidate, George Herbert Walker Bush. I got elected chairman, and we were nothing. I mean, we were 20-year-olds, 22 and 21 and 22-year-olds. My executive director was a young kid from South Carolina named Harvey Lee Atwater. So Lee and I were summoned to the 4th floor for a lecture. We'd never met the chairman before. It was August of 1973, and he was tall, patrician, athletic, looked like a god. Gave us a lecture. Boys, behave. Don't create crime. Don't get into trouble. Don't misspend your money. We give you a little bit of money. Be responsible. You know, we're going to give you assignments. We want them done quickly and effectively. Don't be a problem. And he said, "Do you have any questions, boys?" And Atwater, unbeknownst to me, had a question. Atwater, when he got nervous, would sort of, his clothes would sort of go like this, and he'd sort of start twitching. Chairman, I got a question. Bush says, "Well, what is it, Lee?" He says, "Is it true you have a Boston whaler with 2 Evinrude 387s that you keep on the Potomac?" Bush is sort of like, "Yeah." "Can I borrow it this weekend? There's this real cute girl coming up from South Carolina, and it would really impress her if I could take her out on Potomac, and I've handled that kind of boat before, and I'll return it full of gas." Bush says, "Okay." Gives Atwater the boat. I said, "What the hell did you do that for?" He said, hey, you haven't met Sally. She's really cute. Eventually married her. So anyway, about 5 weeks later, for reasons completely unbeknownst to me, I get this call from the chairman's chief of staff who says, the chairman would like to offer you a job as his special assistant. I'd met him one time for 10 minutes, and he offered me a job and set the arc of my life, just literally. Everything that followed thereafter was a result of that experience. He went off to China and then to the CIA, and I was at the committee, and I went to work for Dick Obenchain as his chief of staff. And I was telling Larry this. I get this call from a guy, some of you may know him, Bill Royal, who was, at that point, a storied Virginia Republican operative, and he said, "Chairman McMath and I were thinking we'd like to talk to you about becoming the finance director of the Republican Party of Virginia." Now, this is back in the old days. So the Republican Party of Virginia staff consisted of the executive director, the secretary, and the finance director. That was it. And I said, "Well, thanks, Bill, but I got an awfully nice job here at the National Committee working for Dick Obenchain." And he said, "Well, I know that, but Dick told us to call you." And I'm like, uh-oh. So Dick was down in Richmond, and he would come up for several days a week. So I waited until he came into the office that week, and we went over the list of things that we had to talk about. And I said at the end, "Hey, Bill Royal called me and, said he wanted to interview me about a job to be the finance director of the Republican Party." And I remember it like it was yesterday. Dick did not look up from the papers he was signing. He said, Yeah, I told him to call you. And I'm like, crestfallen. So I went down that Friday, interviewed. They said, we'd like to offer you the job. I did not know how to raise money, but they offered me the job. And so I called Dick up and I said, well, I met with McMath and they've offered me the job. And he said, I think you ought to take it. And of course, I'm like completely crestfallen. And so I accepted the job. And on Monday, Dick announced his resignation as co-chairman of the Republican National Committee. He was a Reagan guy, and Ford was president, and he felt as a matter of honor that Ford deserved to have a co-chairman of the committee who would support him, but he wanted to make certain I was in Richmond to be around for a Senate campaign in 1978, so I learned how to raise money. But that's how it made it. Literally, I went to work for Bush, dated a Texan, married a Texan while I was living in Richmond. She cried all the way back to Richmond, so I was a dead man, and in the fall of in the winter of 76, 77, I went to Texas. But I really enjoyed my time in Virginia and fond memories of the friendships that I made here. The only southern state to vote for Gerald R. Ford. I was the deputy director of the Virginians for Ford campaign, and my job was we had two surrogates, both of whom were thinking about running for senator in 1978, and my job was to staff them. I had to develop their schedule, plan out their program, write their speeches, handle their press, and travel with them. One was Dick Obenshain, and the other was the recently resigned Secretary of the Navy, John Warner. And after the election, Warner who was trying to cultivate me. He didn't know I was stuck going to Texas. He wanted me to work in his campaign. He said, will you help me I got a speech I need to give at VMI. Will you help me write the speech? So I helped him write a speech. And he said, why don't you come up to VMI to hear me speak and deliver it? And so he was like jollying me along. So I go up to VMI. He says, come up, there's going to be a party. So they have a party, and I walk in, and everybody is in tuxedos, and I've got the threadbare suit, the only guy in the thing. And so he continues to jolly me up by saying, look, we need to go over the speech tomorrow morning. Will you come over to the visitor's house, and let's have breakfast and go over the speech one more time before I go give it? So the next morning I show up, knock on the door, and the door opens up, and there is Mrs. John Warner in her nightgown. And boy, are those eyes blue. And Elizabeth Taylor welcomes me in. Warner comes down the stairs dressed in the tuxedo from the night before. She says, John, go put on a suit. You're not going to wear that stupid tuxedo. And she says, would you like some breakfast? Elizabeth Warner fixed me scrambled eggs and bacon. Just the two of us, her in her nightgown. Anyway, I've never forgotten the moment. Could you discuss the merits or lack thereof of open primaries and and ranked choice voting? I am a huge opponent of ranked choice voting. I think this experiment in Maine, where you vote for your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, is going to delay the outcome of elections, undermine confidence in the election, and cause people to say this is all designed to keep one party or the other, depending on what the dominant strain is in the state, from the minority party from winning elections. And it's stupid, in my opinion. Just straightforward. You get to choose between whoever's on the ballot and the winner who's got the most votes. And if you want to have a runoff provision like Georgia has, where you got to get 50% of the vote, fine. But let's not make it more complicated. It took days and days and days to have the outcome of the governor's race in Maine, and it took even longer for some of the little races at the bottom. Open primaries, we got them in Texas. So I sort of like them. You know, we heard the discussion earlier about lame duck sessions. Don't have lame duck sessions. I got an even better answer. Abolish year-round legislative sessions. You may not know this. Paul is right. Texas is a highly partisan state. We take our politics serious. You got Friday night football, and you got politics, and both of them are blood sports. But this will amaze you. We're the second largest state in the union, and our legislature meets for 140 days every 2 years. We have a biennial budget and a biennial legislature, and we pay them $600 a month. And we make them go home for a year and a half out of every 2 years and live under the laws they pass for the rest of us. And we have a citizen legislature with cotton farmers, union officials, school teachers, insurance agents, retired people, and drunks. And this will blow your mind. In the Texas State Senate, we have 21 Republicans and 10 Democrats. And in the House, we have 88 Republicans and 62 Democrats, and we do not organize our legislature on a partisan basis. Yesterday, the assignments were made in the House, and there are like 8 out of the 20 committee chairs are Democrats. Chairman of the Transportation Committee, Democrat. Chairman of the Higher Education Committee, Democrat. In the state Senate, out of the 7 committee chairs that are really important, 2 of them are Democrats. And the vice chairs of every committee, if there's a Republican chairman, there's a Democratic vice chairman of the committee. If there's a Democratic chairman, there's a Republican vice chair. And we get contentious about high-profile things like gerrymandering and redistricting. And last time around, we had a stupid bathroom bill that got a lot of people going. But we operate as much as possible in a nonpartisan basis. Remember when all the legislatures had to cut their budgets a couple of years ago? Texas had to cut their budget, their biennial budget, by $10 billion. Now, I don't mean the future growth. I meant we had to go from a $110 billion biennial budget to a $100 billion budget, and it passed the Texas House of Representatives 147-3. Because the time limit of 140 days and a relatively nonpartisan organization forced them to sit down around the table and work out common sense solutions. So I don't know about lame duck sessions. I say send the sons of bitches home for about 1.5 years out of every 2 years and you'll be better off. I'm from North Carolina. My condolences. Gerrymandering is real, in my perspective, a threat to our fair and free elections. Is there any hope? First of all, if it's been a threat, it's been a threat since Eldridge jerry-rigged Massachusetts in, I think it was 1803. And believe me, I'm a cynic about this. We heard all this talk about public commissions. California has public commissions. They had their first set of hearings. They wrote up the plan that's now in place. And immediately after they installed it, the Democratic Party went out and publicly announced how they had jimmied the whole system to their benefit. And you saw it in the last election. Out of 50-some-odd members of the California congressional delegation, 7 of them are Republicans. If you look at the percentage of the Republican vote in the last election and just simply said they ought to have the same number of representatives as their share of the vote, there should be 18 more Republicans in the state of California. In my opinion, only one state and one state alone has been able to get this job done through use of a nonpartisan commission, and that is the state of Iowa, where they're all sort of nice people, heavily Scandinavian, dosed up with a lot of German Catholics on the eastern side, Church of Christ in the west, and they seem to be polite to each other, and they say we have to minimize the number of county and city lines we crossed, and we only have 4 districts to divide up, and as a result, they've got relatively competitive districts. But you look wherever else these so-called nonpartisan commissions have been used, and they don't result in my opinion, in fair outcomes. And California is a prime example. So I hate to say there's no way to take politics out of politics, but look, in Texas, we used to have, when I went to Texas, they hunted Republicans with dogs, literally. We had, out of 150 members of the Texas House, 13 Republicans. We had 3 out of 20-some-odd members of the U.S. House. And every time we get around to redistricting, the Democrats would screw us. Well, fine, that's politics. But I don't know what the answer is to it ain't nonpartisan commissions. California is the prime example of how they can be jimmied. We're not going to get to all of these. I want Sabato to signal me when it's time to go to the close.
One more question. Okay, and then Karl has agreed to stay afterwards and take selfies and answer additional questions. And the rest of you can get your boxed lunches. They look so good, Karl. So,
all right, well, there's a great question here about leadership, but I'm going to tell you, wait for my next book on presidential leadership, and the answer will be in there. 17, actually restore American. I'm going to touch on this one because it's a nice segue. The current administration has brought to light the negative aspects of a strong executive with little or no check or balance. I don't agree. We have plenty of checks and balances. It has also highlighted the ability of a Senate Majority Leader to prevent congressional action. What's new? I was there in 2000. We were talking about this morning at breakfast. I was there in 2007 with Harry Reid. We'd spent 3 years trying to cobble together a comprehensive bipartisan Immigration Reform Act. Ted Kennedy, John McCain, and George Bush. We had it this close. We had an agreement after 3 years of hard work that we got some people on the right who were concerned about the bill, who said, if I get a shot to offer an amendment, which might get accepted, like you can't be on welfare and be trying to become a U.S. citizen. You got to be self-sufficient. You can bring your parents over if you're a U.S. immigrant. You want to bring your parents over, but you're responsible for their financial support. Or you don't get credit for the years that you worked as an illegal worker. You don't get credit for Social Security payments. So there were amendments that would be made like this. Kennedy found them largely acceptable, and he agreed. In order to bring these people aboard, they got to get a shot to make it better. So we were going to have what was called a vote-a-rama, in which there were 94 projected amendments. It probably would have ended up being considerably less than that, but it would have been a chance for people to be able to say, I went home and I voted for comprehensive immigration reform because I made the bill better with my little amendment. And just before we got ready to vote, without consulting with Kennedy, McCain, or the White House, the majority leader, Harry Reid, decided he was going to invoke Rule 14B, limit the number of amendments to 4 amendments, designated the amendments, mostly carried by Byron Dorgan of North Dakota, and every one of them was designed to gut comprehensive immigration reform, to destroy the support of the business community and the ag community for comprehensive immigration reform, and he brought down the bill. So look, we've always had strong executives, or at least in the modern era, and we've always had majority leaders, whether it was Lyndon Johnson or Mitch McConnell or Harry Reid, who've been strong and been able to determine the course of the body. And thank God that occasionally they do. I didn't appreciate Harry Reid's leadership, but I think McConnell is going to be, his leadership is going to be the thing that's going to get the Republicans out of the shutdown box canyon and get us some comprehensive reform, not comprehensive reform, but some reform on Dreamers and maybe the TPS, the temporary protected status people. And it's because he's smart, knows when to move and how to move, and will give everybody a shot at the answer. But this raises the broader question. How broken are we? And is it irretrievable? And I hear this, you know, I've got some friends who are really dour, and I get it, but I'm not. Because if you look at the sweep of American history, we've been in worse places before. Some in this room can remember 1968, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. Did you feel like the country was coming apart? You know, we had the Great Depression. The book that I'm working on presidential decision making, I'm going through the era leading up to the election of 1800. Talk about a broken country. We all remember Sumner being caned by Butler in the run-up to the Civil War. There's a brilliant new book by Joanne Freeman on that entire decade, and it turns out violence was routine in the U.S. Congress. But then I wrote this book that Larry was kind enough to mention. I strongly recommend it to you. I think I did a hell of a job with it.
I agree.
Thank you. Now, and look, you know, if you in political science majors, how many of you studied realignment theory? 5 great American elections that changed American politics. There's a political system in place before, and then it changes, and it's something different after the election of 1800, the end of the Federalist era, and the emergence of the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson. 1828, the birth of the modern Democratic Party. 1860, the end of the Whigs, the emergence of the Republicans. 1896, 1932, the emergence of the New Deal. But the election we study least among them is the election of 1896. And when we study it one of 2 ways. It is either the election involving the dynamic young boy orator of the Platte, William Jennings Bryan, 36 years old, populist leader who becomes the nominee of the Democratic Party and then loses, and we ignore the guy who actually won, or we see it as sort of an anonymous election in which these forces of populism and industrialism and capitalism and immigration sort of come together as anonymous forces and weave their way through the political system and generate an outcome, which to some degree is true. All of 4 of those things are important. But the election of 1896 is really an election about people who do strange things. It's a story with sex and violence and backstabbing and betrayal and twists and turns worthy of a coked-up Hollywood screenwriter. The outcome is very much up in doubt and is settled not by anonymous forces, but by the actions of individuals in responding in this crucible of a very important election. And the figure who ought to dominate the story is the mild-mannered governor, reform-minded Republican governor of Ohio, who's a different kind of Republican, who becomes the first Republican to be endorsed by a member of the Catholic hierarchy. The Anglo-Saxon Republican Party is so open to new forces that he takes on the biggest anti-immigrant group in the country, receives the support of leaders of the Catholic hierarchy, has a rabbi open the Republican National Convention, and is the first presidential candidate of either party to appear in front of a group of black voters and openly ask for their support for his party's nomination, which he does in March of 1895, first in Jacksonville, Florida, and then 3 days later on April 1st in Savannah, Georgia. A remarkable man, and nobody pays any attention to him. But to understand William McKinley, who incidentally enters the Civil War at the age of 18 as a private and ends the war as a major, having survived 3 suicide missions and having been recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor, which he refused to have his application pressed because he said, "I was only doing my duty." He spent most of the war in the Shenandoah Valley. He is the first Republican presidential candidate to ever meet with an organized group of Confederate veterans. He invites 2,000 men of the Shenandoah Valley campaign in butternut gray uniforms to come to Canton, Ohio. The first time a Republican presidential campaign has ever been seen with Democratic war veterans in a moment of national unity that is heart-wrenching to read. 2,000 Confederate veterans, along with their Union compatriots, march up North Market Avenue on October 9th of 1896. McKinley emerges on the stage, gives a very emotional short speech and says, sectionalism was surrendered. Only sectionalism was surrendered at Appomattox, not honor. If we are ever forced to fight again, God forbid that we shall fight as brothers under a common flag. The country has never seen this. But to understand that election, I had to understand the Gilded Age. And the more I studied the Gilded Age, the more I realized it's like today, only worse. We have 5 presidential elections in a row in which nobody gets 50% of the vote. Nobody. 2 of those presidents are elected with a majority in the Electoral College, but lose the popular vote, as Bush did in 2000 and Trump did in 2016. A third president is elected with a majority in both the popular vote and the Electoral College, but his popular vote margin is 9,600 votes. We have 2 years with a Republican president, House and Senate, 2 years with a Democratic president, House and Senate, and 20 years of divided government where nothing gets done. Because they not only have deeply divergent views about the future of the country, but they hate each other's guts. They are still fighting the Civil War. When the Democrats take control of the House in 1874, for the first time in 16 years, it's called the victory of the brigadiers, because so many former Confederate officers are now elected in southern districts, primarily through the mechanism of, through violence and intimidation, restraining the black Republican vote. Even in 1896, there are 3 states in the South, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, in which a majority of the men over the age of 21 are black, and they're overwhelmingly Republican. And the best that McKinley can get in any state is 25% of the vote in Louisiana, because the black vote is being wiped out by law and violence. He gets 7% of the vote in Mississippi, where nearly 60% of adult men are black. And the politics is ugly. You read these congressional record debates, and at moments they're unbelievably vicious. There's a meaningless vote. Well, it's not meaningless. Democrats try and pass a free trade measure through the House in 1884. They know it's never got a chance in the Senate, but they want to sort of set up the tone for the general election, the presidential election that fall, and it fails because a smart, adroit protectionist on the Ways and Means Committee organizes across the aisle and gets 40 Democrats, mainly from sheep-growing districts, to vote against this free trade measure because it's going to hurt the sheep growers back in their districts. William McKinley. And one of the Democrats who's angry about this stands up and begins to excoriate his fellow Democrats. He calls them the 40 thieves. and attacks a former Speaker of the House, Democrat Speaker, saying he and his 40 thieves have stolen this from us, and begins to take one particular member and just dump over him in ways that are just unbelievable. Finally, the member's had enough. He stands up, Mr. Speaker, the member's violated the decorum of the House. The Speaker says, the honorable gentleman from Georgia is out of order. And he turns to his colleague who's just had him reprimanded and says, I would not blank you if you were a dog. Now, it's 4 letters, lipsed out in the congressional record, but I have a general sense of what he was saying. You think it's bad today with a shutdown? We're going to shut down a quarter of the government for 34 days? In 1888, the Republicans elect the president, the Senate, and have a narrow majority in the House. Back then, they were civilized. They swore him in in March, and then they brought him back after the summer had cooled off in October or November. And that year, they came back in November of 1889, and the House begins to meet. And the Democrats announce that because it's a narrow majority for the Republicans, they will not answer the roll call. They will deny the House the ability to have a quorum and thereby conduct business. So for 2 months, the House of Representatives of the United States of America is not able to pass a single bill. Because whenever they have a vote, and somebody calls for a quorum call, the Democrats don't answer the quorum, and they don't have a quorum, and they can't vote. Finally, Speaker Thomas Brackett Reed's had enough. 6 foot 3 inches tall, very erudite, 300 pounds, sort of looks like a bowling pin with a walrus mustache painted on him. Very erudite, has a private library in Maine of 5,000 volumes, has a French tutor that he meets with every afternoon to perfect his French. Smart and tough. He's had enough. So on a motion, a typical motion of the Gilded Age, this is also something revealing. In the Gilded Age, if you were in the majority in the House, and there was a minority member who had been reelected by a small number of votes, you phonied up an election challenge and kicked him out in order to grow your majority. McKinley himself, who won re-election in 1882 by 7 votes, is kicked out. Takes him a year and a half to kick him out, but he's kicked out in 1884 on an election challenge. So on this day, in January of 1890, the Republican Speaker is going to kick out a West Virginia Democrat who's won re-election by 50 votes. So they have the vote, but he's prepared. He has sergeant-at-arms stationed in front of every door in the House chamber, and unbeknownst to the members, he's had the doors barricaded on the outside. So at the end of the vote, a quorum call is called. The Democrats refuse to answer the quorum call. There's not a quorum present, and Reed says to the clerk, the chair directs the clerk to show Mr. Jones present, Mr. Smith present, calls out the name of every Democrat on the House floor. First thing that happened is they all head for the exits. But they can't get out because the sergeant-at-arms have linked arms. One Democrat gets out of the House chamber. Constantine August of Russ County, Texas, beats the crap out of the sergeant-at-arms and uses his cowboy boots to kick out the slats in the door and make good his escape. One enraged Democrat from Kentucky stands up and says, under God and the Constitution, you have no right to count me present upon the floor without my permission, to which Reed coolly replies, does the honorable gentleman from Kentucky deny he's present on the floor of the House? This kicks off a 2.5-month-long debate, first on the floor of the House and then in front of the United States Supreme Court as to whether or not the Speaker of the House has the right to direct the clerk to show people present on the floor who haven't answered the call. And in the meantime, not a single bill is passed in the House of Representatives. Now, was the debate tough? Yes. The opening day of the debate, another Texan makes a contribution to the tone of the time. William Henry Martin of Athens, Texas, 6 foot 6 inches tall, thin as a rail, mean as a snake, fought the entire Civil War as an officer in the celebrated Hood's Brigade. Some of your Civil War historians will recognize this ferocious fighting unit. His nickname was Howdy. He got his nickname because after one particular battle, Robert E. Lee asked for the privilege of reviewing the Hood's Brigade in person, and as he rode by and inspecting the troops, Martin, who was a staff officer, stood up in his stirrups, took off his Texas hat and waved it at Lee and yelled out, "Howdy!" Howdy Martin stands up on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, points a bony finger at Reed standing on the podium and says, if any member, turning to his fellow Democrats, will order me to remove this dictator from his position of power upon the podium, I will do so by force forthwith. Reed says, the honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order, and moved on. Martin is so pissed off that the next day he shows up, takes a seat where John Hager is, right in front of the speaker's podium, pulls out his 16-inch long Bowie knife, and spends the entire day's session methodically sharpening it on his boot sole in order to menace Speaker Reed. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but after the Republicans took control in 2010, I don't remember Nancy Pelosi doing that with her stilettos in 2011. I just don't. My point is this. We had a broken system. And the responsibility for the brokenness probably fell on both parties. But along came an opportunity for the American people to pick somebody who would restore decorum and unite the country. It's hard for us to imagine the scene of October 9th. It's hard for us to imagine the moment where the country saw blue and gray together. But the news reports of the time say that there were people lining the streets of the small village. Thousands of people had come to see this spectacle. And there's the Grand Army of the Republic Band and the United Confederate Volunteer Band, and they're playing patriotic music as blue and gray together in units and squads move up North Market Avenue. And people begin spontaneously singing songs, patriotic songs, and openly weeping. Every member of the Confederate delegation has been given a badge, half blue and half gray, with a chromolith of McKinley at the bottom. And on the badge is a favorite quote of McKinley's taken from Washington's farewell address. No East, no West, no North, no South, but a common country. I have one of the badges, and we'll be a common country again. Thanks for having me.